Today's video continues looking at the national interest, specifically with regards to Indonesia, and we're interested in its environmental security. So this term environmental security refers to threats to ecosystems, and these might be ecosystems within a state or that go across states. These can often be caused naturally by earthquakes or hurricanes, but threats can also be caused by economic activity, like cutting down forests, or by military actions. Degradation can involve the degradation of the air, the water or land resources, but in the context of Indonesia we're interested in forests, what's happening to Indonesia's forests, and how is Indonesia reacting. Here we have a summary of the different national interest priorities, and of course we're up to this second one here, environmental security. So a bit of background to this issue, you can see some of these images here that capture deforestation in Indonesia. Globally there is a deforestation threat, and in part it's due to globalization. Globalization allows companies to move resources much quicker. As well as population growth, the world needs more resources, therefore we're using the resources that the earth is producing. Indonesia is the #1 logger in the world, and so it doesn't want that tag associated with it. It needs to do something about that, and it is. There are more and more concerns over things like deforestation, and in part these are being spread by environmental groups who have this ability to spread their message much more easier now because of the internet, because of things like YouTube. They can collect information, create videos, spread information much more easily. There's also this move towards seeing forests as a different form of asset. Rather than chopping down the forest and using the wood, seeing forests as eco-tourist assets, and money can be made through tourism in this way. And finally, there's this idea of being a good international citizen. States like Indonesia want to be respected, they want to have status in the international community, and so they need to be seen to be doing the right thing, as well as actually doing the right thing. So, why is environmental security in Indonesia's national interest? This graph shows us forest cover in Indonesia over a 15-year period. And you can very clearly see that the amount of forest cover in Indonesia is decreasing over this time period. So there is less and less acreage of forest. And this graph shows us that they lost roughly 50 million acres of forest. To put that in perspective, the entire city of Melbourne, so from right down south in Frankston, right up into the northern suburbs, east to Dandenong and west all the way out almost to Geelong, that's about 2 million acres. So if you imagine an area the size of the entire city of Melbourne cut down, that's 2 million acres. Indonesia lost 50 million acres. So imagine 25 city of Melbournes destroyed in this time period. This graph shows forest cover in Indonesia and Malaysia and how much is being lost across the different islands. Obviously in some areas like Sumatra, New Guinea, much more significant problem than in other areas. And just one more image. The areas of red show forest cover loss. You can see it's concentrated in some areas. But the green also shows how much of Indonesia is covered in forests. So it's got densely forested areas. So what has been Indonesia's response? The UN has a program called UN RED. It stands for the United Nations Program on Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. So the REDD stands for Reducing Emissions, Deforestation, Degradation. And Indonesia has gotten on board, wants to be a part of this program. The program is about collaboration. It's about initiatives in developing countries. And Indonesia is still a developing country. So the program tries to support meaningful action, informed action by all stakeholders in relation to deforestation and forest degradation. And this environmental push is part of a global emphasis, in part by the UN, in part by non-state actors who understand the threats of environmental degradation, especially as the population of the globe continues to grow. So Indonesia is fully active in this UN RED program. Another action or response it has taken is to join with Australia. And so the Indonesia-Australia Forest Carbon Partnership was signed in 2008. You can see in this image Kevin Rudd, the Australian Prime Minister at the time, signing the document with President Bambang Yudhoyono, the Indonesian President. This partnership is about Australia, a developing state, working with Australia, a developed state, working with a developing state, Indonesia. And it's about practical cooperation. So Australia lending their expertise to Indonesia, also investing. Australia has committed $40 million to Indonesia and to their initiatives to help reduce deforestation and forest degradation. This relationship, this partnership, is about policy cooperation, so working together on policy. It's about technical support, so Australia offering their experts, and also about identifying what kind of activities can take place and helping to implement those activities so that Indonesia can meet its UN RED guidelines or goals. Now let's have a look at two short videos on UN RED and the Indonesia-Australia partnership.
RED is a new international framework to help stop deforestation. It stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation in Developing Countries. Why do we need RED? Because destroying tropical forests releases more carbon dioxide than the entire global transport sector. Without a solution to deforestation, there won't be a solution to climate change. Tropical forests also sustain half of all life on Earth and generate vital services for the planet, such as producing rainfall and cooling the land surface. And 1.4 billion of the world's poorest people also depend on these forests for their survival. How will RED work? As well as reducing their own carbon dioxide emissions, under RED, industrialized countries will pay developing nations to keep their forests standing. Until now, forests have only had economic value when cut for their wood or cleared for their land. An area of tropical forest the size of a football pitch is destroyed every 4 seconds. Increasingly, this is to satisfy global demand for products like timber, beef, soy, and palm oil. So who gets paid under RED? Countries that reduce emissions from deforestation, plus countries that continue to conserve large areas of intact forest, countries that plant new trees, and countries that only use their forests sustainably. When will RED begin? Officially after 2012, if a new international climate treaty includes RED. But we cannot afford to wait, because once lost, these forests will be gone forever. And how much will it cost? That's a billion-dollar question. To halve deforestation by 2020, financing for RED will need to scale up to an estimated $38 billion a year. But doing nothing is a trillion-dollar disaster every year. So how will RED work? It will take more than just money. Many different stakeholders, from local farmers to national governments, will need to cooperate for RED to be effective. RED will only work if the needs and rights of indigenous people and local communities are respected. If governance is strengthened to ensure that payments don't end up in the wrong hands, and if monitoring systems are put in place to ensure that emissions reductions are real and permanent. So what next? Business as usual is not an option. Forest destruction is accelerating climate change and damaging the Earth's life support system. REDD may be the last, best chance to save tropical forests. But to get REDD right, we need to get ready for REDD now.
So Indonesia has recognised or has many of the same challenges that were identified in that video. They've gotten on board with REDD and they've partnered with Australia. Here we have a commentator, an Australian, talking about that partnership.
My name is Tim Jessup. I'm an advisor with the Indonesia-Australia Forest Carbon Partnership, which is a bilateral program of the Indonesian and Australian government in Indonesia to test and develop approaches to REDD+ and to work with Indonesia to build capacity for what we envisage will be a future national REDD+ system that's part of an international framework. It's been going since 2008. We're now scheduled to continue till mid-2013. And it currently has a funding envelope or total budget of 100 million Australian dollars. And this is divided into 3 or 4 main divisions. The largest single one is the Kalimantan Forests and Climate Partnership, the KFCP. That's $47 million allocated for that, which is a REDD+ demonstration activity in central Kalimantan. There's another $30 million allocated for a similar REDD demonstration activity in Jambi province, which will be called the Sumatra Forest Carbon Partnership. There's 10 million allocated for INCAS, the Indonesia National Carbon Accounting System, and then there's additional money for policy work at the national level. This is money that's committed by the Australian government to implement activities on the ground, all of the $100 million, and well, on the ground and in space and throughout Indonesia. Norway's is a bit different. You should really ask them to explain it, but most of their money is set aside to pay for emissions reductions in the future, not to pay for the activity on the ground. So in that sense, we're investing more in what's called the readiness phase, the preparation, the capacity building, and testing how REDD can work on the ground. Okay, well, the major activity, as I mentioned, or the largest single activity, is the KFCP in central Kalimantan. And this is a REDD demonstration activity which is testing on the ground how REDD can work. So we're working in this particular activity from the grassroots up or from the bottom up. We're working in 7 villages and over an area of 120,000 hectares in degraded peatland and peat swamp forest. And we're trying to test through something we call village agreements, how the communities themselves can be enabled to do most of the work of forest protection, management, peatland rehabilitation. And these will be, or are beginning to be done through payments to the villages through these village agreements.
And finally, are you optimistic of the future for forests in Indonesia?
Well, I guess I have to be optimistic. I wouldn't be doing this otherwise. But I'd say just in the past few months I've seen reason to be optimistic. The commitments by the President, the commitments by Pak Kuntoro of the UKP4, a commitment by the Central Kalimantan province, including the governor, to make REDD+ work in that province. There's, as we heard earlier today, there's interest from the private sector in investing in this. More and more groups, interest groups and civil society organizations are seeing what's in it for them, if you like. They're seeing benefits. Unless a broad group of stakeholders sees benefits, it's not going to work. So we have to see REDD+ as part of sustainable development, built into a better way of using forest resources that doesn't destroy the forest but preserves and protects the forest. So I'm optimistic that we can do that.
Okay, so what type of power is Indonesia using? Predominantly it's using diplomatic power. So let's refer back to our definition of diplomacy and diplomatic power. This refers to discussions and agreements between states as they seek to fulfill their national interest. So in this case, the national interest is environmental security, reducing deforestation, and so the agreement is the Australian-Indonesian Forest Carbon Partnership. And that's one type of power that Indonesia is using to achieve its national interest. It's working cooperatively with Australia. What it's also doing is using a foreign policy instrument. And that instrument is diplomacy. And the following 3 dot points I've copied across from that Indonesia-Australia Carbon Partnership. And you can see the language here. Policy cooperation, technical support, identifying and implementing. All languages about working together. In this case, 2 states working together, Australia and Indonesia. So that would be the main foreign policy instrument at work here. As to the effectiveness of the response, you can see here that there are some practical results. More than 50,000 seedlings planted in 2011 and more than 1.3 million being raised. You've got local communities receiving incentives which are tied to projects. Australia helping establish Indofire, a fire monitoring system, and you've got actual money being committed to this partnership, $100 million. So they are some practical examples of the effectiveness of this response. You've also got symbolic results, or you could say the response is symbolically successful. 2 states working very closely together. A partnership, an example of bilateralism. So you could say this is an effective response to the challenge. It's short term, so we can't see the long-term benefits yet. We can only see the initial phases, but they're positive thus far. Okay, and you have 3 questions to answer for next lesson. They're on the screen here. Now might be a good time to hit pause and write these down. Finally, if you're looking for additional resources, there are 3 articles that have been put on my classes. I strongly encourage you to read them, maybe copy down a few of the statistics on them. And finally, there are more video resources at the STC Global Politics website.